Hey, it's Drew. And I'm guessing that as a podcast listener, you also enjoy audiobooks. Well, in that case, did you know the audio version of Renegade Marketing 12 Steps to Building Unbeatable B2B Brands was recently ranked the number one new B2B audio book by B2B Authority? Kind of cool, right? Anyway, you can find my book on Audible or your favorite audiobook platform. And speaking of audio, before we get into today's show, I do want to do a shout out to the professionals at Share Your Genius. We started working with them several months ago to make this show even better and have been blown away by their strategic and executional prowess. If you're thinking about starting a podcast or want to turbocharge your current show, be sure to talk to Rachel Downey at shareyourgenius.com and tell her Drew sent you. Okay, let's get on with today's episode. Hello, Renegade marketers. Welcome to Renegade Marketers Unite, the top rated podcast for B2B CMOs and other marketing obsessed individuals. Alrighty, folks, you're about to listen to a bonus huddle, a specially curated huddle that we run once a month with experts sharing their insights into the topics that are most important to our CMO community. The expert at this particular huddle was Erica Seidel, the founder of the Connective Good, a boutique recruiting firm that specializes in CMOs. She joined us to discuss career management. So let's get to it. Hello, huddlers. I'm thrilled to introduce you to Erica Seidel. Her philosophy is that recruiting needs to look less like procurement and more like one-to-one sales and marketing. Erica has played several huddlers in their roles and is one of the few recruiters that I've heard about with a pristine reputation as a force of good in the industry. Her core focus is placing CMOs and VPs of marketing in B2B SaaS companies, very specific size, 20 million to 200 million. Previously, Erica ran Forrester Research's global advisory business for CMOs and digital marketing leaders of Fortune 500 companies. Erica has an MBA in marketing from the Wharton School of Business at University of Pennsylvania and a BA in international relations from Brown. She has been on the advisory board for the MarTech conference, and she serves as a coach to the Ascendant Network for the industry's top digital marketing leaders. And she co-leads the Marketing Tech in the Hub invite-only event series. So welcome, Erica.
Thank you so much, Drew. It sounds so much better when you read it. So
I am happy to be your press agent. Just give me the word. Happy to do that. So we're going to try to break this conversation into 3 segments. We're going to try to cover a lot. One part is improving the odds of success when you start a new role as a CMO. Part 2 is setting yourself up for your next opportunity. And 3, getting beyond CMO to boards and other executive roles. Okay. So the fact that CMO turnover is notoriously high is not news to anyone. And there are lots of theories as to why. What I think is a great place for us to start is, what can CMOs do going into a new role to improve their odds of success, which may include leaving on their own terms?
I remember making a slide at one point and it said, something like CMOs, they don't fail for lack of talent. They don't fail for lack of effort. They fail for lack of clear role design and lack of alignment. And so there's some key things that need to be in alignment. And I think when they're not, that this is when things go haywire. So budget, expectations, first of all, between CEO and CMO. And then once that CMO is achieving those expectations, you have to look at, the alignment with the budget, the timing, the authority, and the other resources beyond budget. And in my experience, where things have gone awry is where a CEO thought that marketing would change tomorrow, as opposed to, okay, well, the person needs to come in and build a foundation, and maybe the data is a total mess. And so yes, they could start running a ton of campaigns, but if they did, they wouldn't be able to measure them. And so often there's that foundation building that CEOs don't realize has to happen. So I think that's a big one. And then I think another big one is just, we all know that the role of a marketing leader is half doing marketing and half educating on marketing. And if you're a first-time CMO, that might be surprising, that you are doing a lot of educating up towards a CEO and a board. And I don't want to say dumbing it down, but you talk to a CEO differently than you talk to a CMO. And sometimes marketers have a hard time with that in terms of like maybe the data that they share is more about MQLs and people on a page and number of assets created or, what have you, when they should be talking about pipeline revenue, market penetration, whatever it is. I think the third thing that comes to mind, and I'm open to your reactions to this, is just sometimes, so I'm doing this podcast series right now on boards and CMOs and how they align. And there is, I did one where it was a CMO and her board member, an investor, talking together. And the CMO was saying she always wants to meet those investors before she says yes to a job. And so if it's a situation, like a lot of my searches are private equity backed businesses where, the investors are like really in your shorts. And so if you're not aligned with the investor ahead of time, and if that person is not like a champion for you as a CMO, that things can go off.
Totally. That's been my experience as I've watched situations where CMOs haven't been able to leave on their own terms, if you will. But it feels like every single CMO, certainly in huddles, knows that it's all about managing expectations and finding out what those expectations are before you take the job. Yet, even when they ask, it changes. And so this gets to this next question, since you're sort of in SaaS land.
Yeah.
So many of these CEOs are first-time CEOs. So many of them are inexperienced CEOs. And so this expectation of the magic that marketing can do, wave a wand, arrive tomorrow, change everything, even if there's a product problem or a customer service, marketing can fix it. But the flip side of it is they're inexperienced as leaders. They have no marketing experience, but that doesn't stop them. And in fact, that's probably part of the problem, right? They just don't have any experience in marketing. So they think they know it. So what can a CMO do to sort of deal with that?
It's such a good question, Drew. But I think marketers, in a sense, are used to that, right? Because everybody always has an opinion on marketing. I remember when I was at Forrester, we did a research report that was on the marketing of marketing. And it was really popular because marketers realized, hey, they need to educate the organization on what they're doing. I think, again, I think the buy-in at the beginning makes for fewer surprises at the end. I think there are some CEOs that are educatable. And that's fine. So I'd say that's like kind of three kind of types of CEOs. The ones that are educatable, they know what they don't know and they're open to learning. So that's fine. The ones that are just like, hey, go and do your own thing. And I don't understand it, but I don't need to. That can work fine. And then the third type is the ones that, like you're talking about, like they think they know more than they do. And so I would say, like, don't work with those people if it's not quite right. So I think in the interview process, you want to be like paying attention to, are you being listened to? Are you able to kind of move the view of marketing that the CEO has? Maybe not on some huge level, but in some kind of evolutionary, like in this kind of evolution type of way. I think the other thing is that sometimes an outside voice can help a lot. So, maybe it's an agency, maybe it's some kind of coach, or sometimes it's the recruiter that, in the process that, can kind of say things in a way that people listen to. The other thing I would say is, like, I have actually created a list of things that people say and the way they say them that educates a CEO. And in particular, my list started as the education on like brand versus demand, especially in B2B. Brand is like a 4-letter word. And so CEOs are always worried that CMOs are going to start talking about like, oh, brand, they're going to spend all this money. But if CMOs have a way of talking about brand and growth and how they interrelate, they're way better. So one example is just something I saw on LinkedIn. Somebody posted like, oh, it's amazing how successful companies like Zoom that have invested in their brand have become, for instance. And so like I started a list, specific things that you can say, because again, they're going to sound so stupidly simple to a CMO, but that might be what gets CEOs paying attention.
You got that? Stupidly simple. And that's going to stick with me. And I'm thinking about certain CMOs that I have talked to, and this is where I think an experienced CMO has an advantage versus a first-time one, if the CMO is so confident, and I know one CMO who in the last interview that she had, she said, here is how I work. This is the only way I'm going to work to do this thing. If you don't like that approach, don't hire me. And by the way, call my past boss so you can understand what it means to work with me. And what I love about that approach is, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. This is why it's going to work, and take it or leave it. I think it takes a lot of confidence and a lot of experience to get there. And, I'm just curious from a recruiter standpoint, that's got to be a little painful, because this is now you've really narrowed it, because that person, the CEO, has to go, okay, I'm buying, but wow. I mean, have you encountered, when you encourage a CMO when they're doing this interview with a young CEO, to take that approach?
No, I wouldn't. I would encourage them to do some kind of sharing of work. So I think we definitely need to get real. Interviews are broken. They're just not predictive, right? So I would say you definitely need to get real. And it could be like, oh, here's my plan. And again, I don't think it's the 30, well, maybe it's a 30, 60, 90, but people often put together these great plans, but then again, they're not aligned on like, oh, this is what it will take. I will need a team of five people. I will need a budget of X million dollars. This will take 3 months, like we were talking about before. But I feel like a CMO, it's like you have to navigate this paradox, and it's the peacemaker change maker paradox, that you are hired to make change, but then you come in the door, or even before, it's like you have to be making peace as well. So it's like, make change, but do it in a way that's comfortable for us. So what you were suggesting, Drew, that sounds pretty heavy hitting, because, the right CMOs are going to be incorporate. They'll know how to incorporate input from other people, and know when to take it, and know when to say, when to defer it. Like, okay, we're focusing on these priorities for now. We need to be able to focus there, and then we'll come back to you on that. So it seems like it's too heavy of a hammer to do that. Okay, this is the way I work. I mean, I bet that CEO who would say yes to that might be a little bit milquetoasty.
Yeah, or just say, I have other problems I'm going to address. I'm happy to have someone who's confident in their approach and their role. And the answer is yes. This individual did get hired, and she's still in the role 3 or 4 years later, and frankly, doing a fantastic job doing it the way that she proposed. So great question from the huddlers is, if we're trying to find out the CEO and what they're sort of framing, what are the diplomatic questions that they can ask to help evaluate? You mentioned just, are they listening to your ideas, but what else can they do to make sure the CEO isn't not only thinks of themselves as the smartest person in the room, but behaves that way?
Let me broaden the question, Drew, to you want to find the fit for you that makes sense, and you want a company that's going to value marketing. And I talk to candidates all day long, and one of the questions I ask is, what are your top criteria for the new role? And people will often say, oh, a CEO who understands marketing and wants to make a strategic investment in it. And then I'll just say, oh, how do you ask that? Because I'm collecting these questions. And I don't have them all right here, but one good one is just tell me exactly how you see marketing playing a role in the growth story here. Or tell me, how do you define marketing? I ask this sometimes at the beginning of a search. What does marketing mean to you? And then there's also how is it going now in marketing? What would you change? The other question, this is maybe not exactly on the nose for what you're asking, but at the last board meeting, what were the questions about marketing that you struggled to answer? Because those are things that a CEO is going to want to care about. And so, and if it is, hey, our leads are down, well, that's data, right?
Yeah. But I would imagine, again, you mentioned there's sort of the 3 types: the educatable, you just go do it, and tell me everything you're going to do, and I'll tell you whether that's the right way to go. But I get the sense, and this is from lots and lots of huddles conversation, that it's about revenue and the fastest way to revenue. And the CMOs is the clock is ticking from day one, help drive revenue, period. And so regardless of whether or not there's other issues that need to be fixed, like you don't have a CRM, you don't have any kind of marketing automation, you have no plays in place. So, one of the things we talk a lot about are the quick wins, that sort of buy you time to do the other stuff. And number two, even if there's a brand problem, don't make that the initial problem you solve. I'm curious, in your perspective, because
Yeah.
brand is, as we've talked about in huddles, it is a 4-letter word and a lot of it, particularly in VC and PE firms.
Yeah. And it's funny because I was talking about this podcast series I'm doing, and I was talking to a board member. It's coming out tomorrow, actually. And so he's a board member, investor, former CEO. And he was saying, as the board, we assume that you as a marketer are managing your business based on numbers and based on metrics. Only show us the key ones. And don't, and we realize that maybe you've done a big brand revamp in service of revenue. And we don't, just because you've spent a lot of time on it, we don't need to see that. We can see just the outcome of it. And I thought that was smart, that sometimes something you spend 10 minutes on might have more impact than something that you spent like a month on. It's the same, funnily enough, if you're interviewing for a job, you could make 10% of your job sound like 90% of your job if you want to.
Interesting. So if you look at your CMO placements over the last several years, what are the commonalities of the successful ones? What's happening there? What do they look like?
Good careers, it's three things, right? Successful careers, it's good decision-making, it's hard work, and it's good luck. So it's a combination of those three in general. The ones that stick are the ones where they've invested up front in getting the cultural fit right. So they're not just saying, oh, I want nice people and smart people. Everybody wants that. Like, nobody says they want to work with dumb people. It's like they really invest in figuring out, is that cultural fit right for them? They've spent more time. Maybe they've gone early for an interview and, just like sat in the lobby, like when we had lobbies and we were like in person. So they invested in that. They probably benefited from some market factors, right? So where they have put, scale up, like they've gotten that scale up experience. Like, this is what every recruiter, every CEO wants, is like, bring me the person who has scaled from 50 million to 100 million. Or yeah. And the scary thing is sometimes you're successful there despite marketing, and sometimes you're successful there, because of marketing. So, and I think it is this kind of educate up. So, you never want to tell a CEO like, oh, you're dumb and you don't understand marketing. It's more like you kind of sidle up to them and you're like, you have that kind of, I don't know, ability, like it's like educate through inception, just to help them think it was like their idea. And people who focus, and that's another key thing. So sometimes we all have struggles with shiny objects, but the CMOs who can figure out how to focus, okay, this is what I'm going to spend time on. This is what I'm not going to spend time on. Some of them are hiring, depending on the company, and the size and the situation. I'm increasingly seeing like these like chief of staff roles. So like a COO to a CMO who can handle a lot of the operational stuff, because let's face it, the role is breaking, right? It's just too big. It's, you got to be inside oriented and outside oriented, and you got to focus pre-sale and during the sale and after the sale and customer experience. And you have to think like a CFO and you have to think like an investor. It's just a lot. So the more that you can kind of, smartly resource yourself, the better. And I think there is that paradox of that peacemaker, change maker, like people who can kind of thread that needle very, very well. And people have good luck or good skills with hiring, of course. That's also keep it. I'd be curious to do like a little like regression analysis, how much is luck versus, market factors.
It's really, and it's funny because I looked at those three choices. And if I go to luck right now, if you're in ad tech, I don't care how good a marketer you are, it's a really tough thing. On the other hand, if you're in solar or health tech, life is pretty good. Yeah. And so the luck factor, no doubt, matters, because what you hope is that this company has figured out their go-to-market, has a product market fit, has a customer base that really enjoys the product or service that you're providing, and there's room for growth, right? Both within existing customers and current. And so that's kind of the market situation, with being able to choose that company and making a bet on a horse that this horse is well positioned to at least compete. The decisions part of this first thing of making good decisions, I couldn't agree with you more that this is the challenge. And within that, focus falls there, right? Is if you make the decision, I'm going to do 20 things when 3 things are going to really matter, that focus, that decision can really screw you up. I also think probably a significant decision in all of this is like the CMOs that I know that are most successful, they are bringing their data person with them, like from
Wow.
every job, because they know that person has their back. If they have the data right, they at least have that covered. So I think that's an interesting part of this. I mean, one of the things that we talk about in huddles, and you mentioned hard work, and the job, as you just described, is impossibly demanding. You could work 30 hours a day and you couldn't make a dent in all the things that you're being asked to do. So we talk about trying to outsmart the job, not outwork it, because I don't know if anybody can outwork it.
I like that.
And that, I mean, that's why huddles exists, is try help folks outsmart the job. So anyway, so when things didn't work out, where you're getting a call from the company saying, Erica, this placement did not work out, what's that diagnosis or postmortem look like?
So it's rare that I get a call. So me and other executive search people, usually you're guaranteeing that somebody's going to stay for a year.
Right.
One time in 12 years have I had that happen.
That
So
they didn't stay in a year. Okay.
Right. I mean, there was one time that, there were a couple times actually the company got bought a few months later, and then the person, so that's a little outside of my control. There's not this legalese around it, but it's rare in terms of as far as it hits me, but certainly it happens. And I think where people get stuck is where they don't pay attention to those red flags. Like I've had, like probably every week I have a couple CMOs email me like, yeah, I had these red flags when we were getting started. Like sometimes it's like, they're hiring a CEO and a CMO at the same time. So I've seen that where it's like, or a CMO and a CRO and a CEO at the same time. So you're a little bit kind of like jumping into even more of an unknown that you normally would have. I think the other thing is that companies are, especially in like smaller tech companies, that often say like, oh, we want the up and coming leader. So they'll hire somebody who was previously, say, like a director of demand generation, director of growth, to leading all of marketing. And because they're so in love with growth, and again, a lot of CEOs are like overgrown salespeople, right? So they're kind of in love with that. And they might not appreciate that making that leap requires actually a lot of change. Like you have to understand product, you have to understand brand, and you have to understand a team. And now for that new marketing leader reporting to a CEO versus a CMO, again, a totally different ballgame. I think people might kind of diminish that. And I think it also comes back to that timing that, oh, we thought change would happen in faster than it did. And the problem, then the CMO's on their back foot, like, oh, well, of course it would take time. So this is why educating up front and some external validation can help. And I think that's why, like, a group like this, you could say like, okay, here are the benchmarks, the average time for, like, here's a maturity model. Your data maturity is here. And the average time for a company of our size to move from level 1 to level 2 of maturity is a couple of months. And so by that, I'm doing well.
Right.
That's data that a CEO rather would, I think, glom onto.
So, all of this starts with finding out what expectations are, managing expectations, obviously, and ideally doing what you said you would do. And hopefully that is the stuff that the CEO values, so that you're aligning with that. Okay. I want to switch gears a little bit. So we talked a little bit now about, what it takes to sort of get the job and stay in the job. And it literally all comes down to the CMO and the CEO's relationship and the board relationship and their ability to say, we want to do this, we're on track. Doing that, right? It's like managing expectations. So now you had a recent show with Kelly Ford Buckley on upgrading the dialogue with the board. Can you give some tips on how to improve those board relationships?
Yeah. I mean, I'm still in the midst of doing this podcast series, but that one was amazing. It was like, she was just like hit after hit after hit. Like, it was great. So in a nutshell, meet a board member from the beginning during the recruiting process. Make sure that you don't feel like a deer in the headlights around the board, like see them as a resource and engage in a dialogue with them, not just during the board meetings, but outside of board meetings. Make sure you share metrics that they care about. We talked about that before. I think there's also the offer to educate. So again, a lot of board members, it's like some stunningly low percentage. I don't know if it's like 1% or something. I have it somewhere. Is like very few are marketing people. It's starting to grow, but not it's not huge. They're like offering to educate them, not necessarily during a board meeting, but after can be great. Offering a view on the business. So this one that I have coming out tomorrow with a different person, this friend of mine is a CEO and investor. And he's like, I'm looking for a marketing leader to provide a heads up display for the business. So this kind of like goes to what Lotney, I think, calls it, the chief market officer. And again, just adding, another thing to the CMO's list, but looking outward and where is the business going? What are the, kind of opportunities for the business? And I think the other thing that came up in the various podcasts that I've recorded so far, some of them are still in the queue, is like, in terms of your board presentations, there's kind of a mix of things that are the same over time. Maybe once you get to a dashboard and you're sharing that. And then there's the things that kind of depend on the arc of where you are in the business. So the first board meeting, maybe it's like, hey, this is why I joined, and this is my rookie observations. And then maybe it's like, okay, here's the foundational pieces once you have those sorted out. And then these are the opportunities we have as a business. And if times are tough, then you might have a different content. We've been talking a lot about what's the blend of content and confidence that you should bring. Is it just all about swagger, or is it about content? And so that's been an interesting kind of, I'll say think about that blend between content and confidence.
So watch the most recent episode of Perry Mason on HBO. Della Street, this is a moment. Della Street, who is not an attorney, says to Perry, I'm going to do the questioning now. And this actress had the ability to look confident and nervous at the same time. And she presented this information in an incredible way. And then this was like, if you were your first time board member, you want to be Della Street doing it the way she did it. So if I could find that clip somehow, I would share it with the group. But you're right. It's a fine line of having the right content and being confident in the data, but not so overconfident that you're unwilling to sort of take the input. That's why the board is there, right? Is to give input. One little sidebar, CMOs that do end up getting on boards are notoriously in the weeds. And this is the first advice that CMOs get when they're given on the board. You're not there as a marketer, you're there as a board member. But they forget that. In your exploratory on the subject, find out if that's true. I think the number is less than 17% of boards have anybody with any marketing experience at all.
Oh, that's higher than I would think. So
Yeah.
That's okay. That's good.
But yeah, that person may have gone from marketing to another role, which is a great place to shift gears. So market's tight. And you mentioned earlier this square peg, square hole phenomenon that seems to really be taking over hiring. So it's like a $50 million health tech SaaS company. They want somebody who has health tech experience who went from 50 to 100 million. You're seeing that because you already mentioned it. But is there anything that CMOs can do in their current role to sort of set them up for more opportunities?
Yeah. And I think this is like, if you're going to stay in one company for a while, that's a great opportunity for you to flare out within the company and flare out and flare up. Like I was just talking to somebody today who's she'd been a marketing leader at a smaller company, but she had like such DNA of like a chief of staff person. So we were talking about her moving into a COO kind of role. I'm thinking like one example, like a client of mine, Corey Munchbach, who is CEO of Blueconic, and she's like, I don't know, 35 years old. It's hilarious. And she started as like director of product marketing and then VP of marketing and then COO and then CEO. And she just really put in the time. And so there can be value there. I'm also thinking of an example of people who have done like internal internships within the company. So some of you might know this guy named Mark Goloboy, who's in Boston and is a marketing leader. He was at, I forget, one of the companies he was at. He was leading marketing. He decided that he would spend, I want to say, a month as a business development rep. And so he was on the phone. So for that, for that 1 month, he was making calls or, answering the calls. And he was, and the idea was to really learn how that function worked. And what a brilliant way to have marketing and sales, like walk in the shoes of a salesperson or a sales leader. And I talked to one person who had extra budget and she gave it to sales instead. And another person who had extra budget or carved out the budget and said, this would be more valuable to the business if it went to customer success instead. So I think the marketers that evolve are the ones that think business first, marketing second. It's not about my fiefdom and my world. It's about what will help the business. And I think, as you go through your career, your ego tends to drop. So this should be easier as people kind of evolve in their careers. I think it's also like make your wishes known. Sometimes people, they have this internal burning desire to do something different than what they're doing. But step one to manifesting it is to kind of share that with other people, up, out, and across.
Yeah. As you're talking, I was thinking of a couple of CMOs who I've talked to who made a deal with the CFO, said, hey, teach me everything about finance and the business, and I'll teach you everything about marketing. And when I teach you about marketing, I'm going to teach you about how marketing is a lever for growth. And if we do this right, you will actually come to me at some point and say, if I gave you $1 million, what would you do with it? And I wonder, as you talked about it, I hadn't thought of it as an internship, but using these opportunities to sort of expand your focus, which is interesting because earlier on, we just talked about how we got to narrow our focus.
Yeah.
Right. A CMO has 8 hours in a day, make it 10, and they have to make some choices. So,
right. I love that idea, by the way, Drew, I have to say, because when you say that, you're planting a seed that person at some point is going to come back to you and say, oh, I have some extra budget. What would you do with it? So I like it for that.
Yeah, and we've seen that play out. I mean, literally, the CMOs that have done that have then had that experience. And it depended. Some of this depended on where the economy was and how the business was growing. And some of them said, spend that money elsewhere. Yeah. And some of them said, and because there was an agreement on what metrics mattered and how those metrics worked and how the pipeline worked, there was a clear understanding on both sides of this. So in March, we focused our huddles on personal branding, and we talked about doing it in your current position as opposed to just when you are between opportunities and suddenly have time. When you are presenting candidates or you evaluate candidates, is there a benefit to having established themselves as thought leaders?
It depends on the role. I would say often. But it depends. Like if I'm doing a role where the CMO role or VP of marketing is very kind of operationally oriented, where maybe they already have an evangelist or some kind of chief brand person, which some companies have, then they might be like, is this person more of an evangelist, or are they more outward than they are inward? Might be the question. But in general, I think it's good. I mean, I feel like if you feel like you want to express yourself, then express yourself, for God's sake. There's probably something like in you that needs to come out, and that's fine. And also good things happen. You go to conferences, you meet people. It's not just about like, oh, let me share what I know, but you just, you meet people and connect with people. So there's definitely value. It's also like you get findable. So me as a search person, whenever I'm doing a search, I have this scouting roadmap, and I look at different, kind of swim lanes of different companies. And I look at, like this is like Drew, I've pinged you a bunch of times, like, oh, hey, like I have this search and who do you know that like blah, blah, blah. And then I also look at different, what are the top 25 demand gen leaders of 2018 or whatever. I was just looking at that the other day. Having some kind of presence is never a bad thing, but that presence, it doesn't need to be speaking on a huge stage. There's a lot of people who are using LinkedIn to great benefit, just posting their musings on a day-to-day basis. And that could be totally fine.
Yeah, it's funny, as we were talking about this, it was much easier for the CMOs who are committed to an industry. Like if they're in healthcare, because they know that's where their network is going to be. And two, because it's generally good for the company too. Because you're where your personal brand is connected to an industry, it's just their lives is a lot easier. It's harder for the ones that sort of cross. Again, if you're in cybersecurity and you can speak at a cybersecurity conference, it's good for your brand, it's good for the company, it's good for you, all those things. But a lot of CMOs don't want to be pigeonholed by industry, which is probably, get back to you, it's easier for you for when they are, right? Because it's easier to place them. But I don't know. I liked working on a lot of different industries when Renegade was really servicing clients. I love the fact that, because I just get bored with the same industry all the time. So is there a role at all for CMOs who are in one industry to be able to get to another? And is that even a possibility today?
I think it depends on what you mean by what industry. Like I do a lot of B2B SaaS, and again, it gets pretty niche. It's like, oh, B2B SaaS MarTech. Can you go from B2B SaaS MarTech to B2B SaaS cybersecurity? I think you can. I mean, both situations, like total knife fights, very competitive industries.
Right.
And I think that, there's a lot of like similar dynamics. You might have to pitch and kind of educate on why your skills are relevant. What I see a lot more, like I'm doing a search right now, it's an investor and a CEO who I'm mostly working with, and they're like, okay, look, our average deal size is 30K and we close most of our deals within a quarter. So we want that experience. And they said, like our product is not that complicated. Like you could learn it in a little bit of time. So if you've done any kind of like workflow software, that's relevant. Where I do say, so thinking more broadly about where people switch industries, product marketing. I know this is not like a CMO specific thing, but I actually have seen CMOs become product marketers in other organizations, or anybody become product marketers, because product marketing is such a funky role to hire for. And if you know the industry, like, so say you worked, I don't know, say you were a B2C marketer in retail, and then you join a MarTech company that sells to retail, that you have a play there. If the CEO is open to somebody from outside the industry, that speaks well of the company and their kind of, appetite for innovation. So it's not going to be universally accepted. And I would say still, it's easier to stick within one industry, because again, you could be that chief market officer. You can understand it. You can come up to speed faster.
You mentioned the chief market officer. I've seen that when I interviewed Sarah Franklin of Salesforce. She talked about marketers make markets. And is there demand for that? Should every CMO suddenly call themselves chief market officer? It feels like such a nuanced thing.
I think in bigger companies, it's more obvious and more common. I think if you're talking about a tiny startup, I say that. And then like a tiny startup company, like what are they, especially if it's in a new category, what are they doing but making a market, right? It's the middle, like a lot of, like I talked about, like the $20 million businesses they have some scale, they have some product market fit, they're like pouring fuel on the fire. They don't necessarily think of it as, oh, we need to make a new market. It maybe, but usually it's just more like, oh, we need to grow. So I think it depends on where you are, but also you don't want to talk about yourself as too ethereal. You have to kind of just see what the company what the company is looking for, and how can you kind of use their words to talk about your experience. That will take you far, versus like imposing, a kind of characterization of yourself that might be a little left of how the industry views it.
One of the things that you mentioned is occasionally a CEO will say, hey, we're open to people outside the industry. Well, I've heard this story over and over in transition team huddles, where someone is up for a job. They said that they were open to it, and then they didn't get the job because there was somebody who had experience in the industry. I mean, is this just a Don Quixote thing at the moment? If you're in between opportunities, should you even be thinking about things that you don't have industry experience on? I mean, again, you got to focus even when you're not at work.
I like to tell people that there's a recency bias. So whatever you did yesterday you are going to get more of a look than something totally different, unless you have a strong introduction in from, a former colleague that's worked with you, knows you, likes you, knows your work, likes your work, etc. Or if there's a recruiter that's uniquely hired to bring in somebody from another industry, which could be.
Well, and that's interesting. And that gets to the next question, which is one of the things that we talk a lot about is the importance of building your network. Again, it's why you want to get out there. It's why you want to be part of an association like CMO Huddles. And I'm just curious if you have any sense of the CMOs that talk to you versus and then end up getting jobs versus the ones that you end up placing. I mean, I'm imagining that a lot more find jobs because they reached out to a CEO they used to know than necessarily recruiter placed. Does that jive with your data?
Yeah. For every search, I might talk to 50 to 200 people. Yeah. Talk to, sometimes it's email back and forth, depending.
Right.
And sometimes when it's hard, like I have a contact list for every search. So it's like the hard ones are 400 names. And those include sources. So like Drew, right, you're on there as a source for me sometimes. So again, it's very, very niche-y. I had a mentor when I was at Forrester. I had this great client and she was CMO of some big insurance company, Latina women. And I say that because people would often, be like, there's a huge interest in diversity search.
Right.
But she said to me once, she's like, oh, I only got a few calls, like maybe 3 times in my whole career. She's retired. She retired at 50. I only got a few calls like in my career from recruiters. It was usually people I knew. And I was like, you're kidding, And so, so recruiters place the minority of folks. I don't have the numbers, but certainly tapping your network and people who know you, like your work, that is, I imagine that is bigger by a decent factor. And it depends also on the industry. Like, again, I do a lot of like private equity backed searches. Private equity companies, they're investing, they're looking for a quick kind of time to value. So they will pay a recruiter because they're like, the value prop is do it faster, do it better, do a broader search. And so they have no problem doing that because it's part of their kind of like value platform. So, it depends.
Okay. All right. So we're getting close to the end, but I want to make sure that we cover this, which is there are some, and it's not by far, it's not a majority, but the CMOs who do aspire to be COOs or CEOs or sometimes CROs. And I wonder for those, and maybe we've already covered it, but what are the building blocks for that?
I feel like we might have covered it a little bit. I certainly know a bunch of CMOs who have risen to CROs. And again, there's some luck, maybe the CRO leaves, gets fired or whatever. And then the person's like, oh, I can take over this, especially if you're already managing like in a B2B SaaS context, if you're already managing like a BDR, SD kind of team. And so I'm a big fan of these slash careers. I would say, like marketing slash product, marketing slash sales. And especially now, given the economy, every company is looking to do more with less. And so being able to say, I can cover marketing, but I could also cover this other piece of the business. Would that be helpful? But again, to your point, it's like, is that focus or is it like stretching the job?
No, I mean, that's what we, I've been really in transition teams, we're talking about the idea of CMO plus. Because in many ways, if you look at what happened, a lot of these startups got rid of the CMO level, just said, hey, VP of marketing or whatever you are, you're now the head of marketing. And so there are a lot of CMOs out there and that are looking for the next opportunity. And I think if they were talking to the startup world, their only hope is to be CMO plus or slash, as you described it, right? I can do 2 for you. And obviously you're not really doing 2 jobs because you can't, but you can manage people who are doing those 2 things. So again, you really better get good people or you're going to be screwed. So, all right, 2 do's and 1 don't for CMOs when it comes to career management.
Yeah. A do would be like radically collaborate. So this idea of radically collaborate, even when it hurts. So this idea of like giving a budget to another area that hurts, right? But it could be the right thing for the company. I think the other thing is finding the right balance between that inward and outward. The outward might be customers. I'm doing a search and one of my candidates has said, oh, and whenever I join a company, I spend the first month meeting 30 customers. Wonderful, an outward view. And they like that. And balancing that inward with the outward and being intentional about it and maybe sharing internally, how they're spending their time. I would say like in the interview process, it's like Italian cooking, right? What you leave out is just as important as what you put in, and don't puke up your whole history. Practice your story so it doesn't sound rehearsed, but it sounds natural. And you could like, this is not even a story. It's like, a conversation where you can just only drop the things that matter the most to the specific opportunity.
I love radically collaborate. Balancing the inward and the outward makes so much sense. I mean, I remember the last chapter of my first book was Beth Comstock when she was still at GE, and she talked about spending 25% of her time out, either talking to customers or talking to startups. So she knew the cool stuff that was happening out there. And she was in the business of making markets. I mean, Eco Imagination and Health Imagination came out of marketing and they became billion-dollar divisions. So I think that outward focus makes a lot of sense. And I say this a lot in huddles, nothing bad ever happened to a CMO when they started a sentence with, I was talking to a customer the other day and it is a point of authority. In the old days, that was really the strength of a CMO, whether it's B2B or B2C, they knew the customer better. Okay. And then The don't is, yeah, don't overtell. That's
Yep.
amazing. All right. With that, well, Erica, it's been wonderful talking with you. Thanks you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
If you're a B2B CMO and you want to hear more conversations like this one, find out if you qualify to join our community of sharing, caring, and daring CMOs at CMOHuddles.com. Renegade Marketers Unite is written and directed by Drew Neiser. Hey, that's me. The show is produced by Melissa Caffrey, Laura Parkin, and our B2B podcast partner, Share Your Genius. The music is by the amazing Burns Twins, and the intro voiceover is Linda Cornelius. To find the transcripts of all episodes, suggest future guests, or learn more about B2B branding, CMO Huddles, or my CMO coaching service, check out renegade.com. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, and until next time, keep those Renegade thinking caps on and strong.